Okay, here's what I want you to imagine. It's the year 80 CE. You're living in Han Dynasty China. The empire is crumbling from within. Eunuchs are manipulating the emperor, factions are tearing the court apart, and ordinary people are suffering. But here's the thing. Nobody blames politics. Nobody blames corruption. You know what they blame? Ghosts. They blame angry spirits. They blame heaven's displeasure. They blame the fact that someone saw a comet last Tuesday and didn't sacrifice the right number of chickens. I'm not making this up. This was the intellectual climate of one of the world's most sophisticated civilizations. And into this world walks a guy named Wang Chong. Poor kid from nowhere. Can't even afford to buy books, so he stands at bookstalls memorizing what he reads. And this guy, this self-taught philosopher from the provinces, is about to do something absolutely audacious. He's going to tell the entire empire, "You're wrong. All of you. Your ghosts don't exist. Your omens are nonsense. Heaven doesn't care about your moral failings. The universe is a machine, and you're just tiny." Now, before we dive into Wang Chong's philosophy, I need you to understand something crucial. What he did wasn't just intellectually brave. It was professionally suicidal. This is a man who will spend his entire career in minor government posts, constantly clashing with authorities, never getting the recognition he deserved in his lifetime. And why? Because he refused to lie. He refused to pretend that the emperor's dreams predicted the future. He refused to accept that natural disasters were heaven's punishment for human wickedness. Wang Chong represents something we don't often associate with ancient China: radical empiricism, scientific skepticism, the demand for evidence over tradition. And he's doing this in the 1st century CE, more than 1,500 years before the European Enlightenment. So this lecture? This isn't just about some obscure Chinese philosopher you've never heard of. This is about what happens when one person decides that truth matters more than comfort, more than career advancement, more than fitting in with what everyone else believes. This is about the courage to think differently. All right, let's set the scene properly, because you can't understand Wang Chong without understanding the absolute chaos he's living through. The Eastern Han Dynasty, this is roughly 25 to 220 CE, starts off with promise. The Han had briefly collapsed, and now it's been restored. But by Wang Chong's time, around the mid to late 1st century, things are falling apart in slow motion. Picture this. The imperial court is dominated by eunuchs. Now, these aren't just servants. These are powerful political operators who control access to the emperor. They're forming factions, they're eliminating rivals, they're basically running the show while the emperor is often a child or a puppet. Meanwhile, you've got aristocratic families fighting for power. You've got peasant uprisings brewing in the provinces. The whole system is corrupt, inefficient, and everyone knows it's unsustainable. But here's what blows my mind. With all this political dysfunction, with all this very obvious human corruption and incompetence, the educated elite, the people who should know better, are explaining everything through supernatural causes. A drought? Heaven is angry because the emperor lacks virtue. An earthquake? The spirits of the ancestors are displeased. A comet appears? Quick, consult the oracle. What does it mean? Should we change our policies? Should we perform more sacrifices? Now, I want you to understand what had happened to Confucianism by this point. Confucius himself, back in the 5th century BCE, was actually pretty rational. He famously said, "Respect the spirits, but keep them at a distance." He was interested in human ethics, human relationships, practical governance. But by Wang Chong's time, Confucianism had become the state ideology. And when a philosophy becomes state ideology, something terrible often happens to it. It calcifies, it becomes dogma. It gets mixed up with all sorts of superstitious beliefs that have nothing to do with the original teaching. So you've got this weird hybrid: Confucian ethics mixed with folk religion, mixed with divination practices, mixed with astrology, mixed with the belief that heaven directly intervenes in human affairs to reward virtue and punish vice. And here's what's so insidious about this. It's not just that people believe in ghosts and omens. It's that this belief system serves a political function. When bad things happen, you don't have to fix the actual problems. You just need to perform the right rituals. You don't have to address corruption. You just need to find someone to blame for angering heaven. It's a system that protects the powerful while keeping everyone else trapped in superstition and fear. So into this intellectual and political mess walks Wang Chong. And I love this detail. He's born into poverty in Shangyu, which is in modern-day Zhejiang province. His family can't afford books. Think about that. In a society where education is the only path to advancement, where knowledge is literally locked up in expensive texts, this kid is standing at bookstalls in the marketplace, reading over people's shoulders, memorizing what he can. That's how hungry he is for knowledge. That's how determined he is to understand the world. And through sheer persistence, through this voracious, almost desperate reading, he becomes one of the most learned men of his age. He masters philosophy, history, astronomy, natural science, medicine, everything he can get his hands on. But here's the crucial thing. Because he's self-taught, because he's not part of the establishment, because he doesn't owe his education to the traditional system, he's free. He's intellectually free in a way that the court scholars aren't. He doesn't have to pretend to believe things he knows are false. He doesn't have to twist his arguments to fit orthodox doctrine. He can follow the evidence wherever it leads. And what he discovers, what his encyclopedic knowledge reveals to him, is that the universe operates according to natural laws, not divine whims, not moral purposes, not supernatural intervention, natural laws. This is revolutionary, this is dangerous, and Wang Chong knows it, but he writes it down anyway. He compiles about 80 essays. We'll talk more about the Lunheng, his masterwork, later. But these essays systematically dismantle every major superstition of his age. He goes after ghosts. He goes after omens. He goes after the idea that heaven has moral intentions. He even goes after Confucius himself, treating him not as a divine sage, but as a fallible human scholar. And you know what happens? Nothing. Well, not nothing. He gets ignored. His work is too radical, too threatening to established beliefs. His anti-authoritarian stance makes him unemployable in any serious government position. He spends his career in minor posts, constantly clashing with superiors, never getting the recognition he deserves. The tragedy is that Wang Chong is exactly the kind of thinker Han China needs, someone who can cut through the superstition and address real problems with rational solutions. But he's also exactly the kind of thinker the system can't tolerate. So, as we go through his philosophy in detail, I want you to keep this context in mind. This isn't just abstract theorizing. This is a man risking everything, his career, his reputation, his safety, to tell the truth as he sees it. That's what makes Wang Chong not just a philosopher, but a hero of intellectual courage. And that's where we'll pick up next time, with the actual content of his revolutionary ideas. Because wait until you hear what he says about the nature of the universe, about humanity's place in it, and about why everything your ancestors believed is probably wrong. It's going to get interesting. Alright, now we get to the good stuff. Now we get to see what Wang Chong actually believes about the universe. And I'm warning you, this is going to sound shockingly modern. You're going to hear ideas that you associate with the scientific revolution, with the Enlightenment, with modern physics. Except this guy is writing in the 1st century CE. So here's Wang Chong's central claim, and I want you to really sit with this. The universe is a machine, not a creation with purpose, not a moral order, not a hierarchy with humans at the center and heaven watching over us. A machine, a vast, impersonal, mechanistic system operating according to physical laws. Do you understand how radical this is? In Han China, the dominant view, the view taught in every school, preached in every temple, assumed by every educated person, is that the cosmos is fundamentally moral. That heaven, Tian, is a conscious force that rewards virtue and punishes vice. That natural events are messages, omens, divine communications. Wang Chong says no. Wrong. Completely wrong. Let me break down his 3 core claims because they build on each other in a really elegant way. First, the mechanistic universe. Wang Chong argues that natural phenomena occur through the interaction of qi, which we might translate as vital energy or material force. But here's the crucial thing. Qi operates according to fixed patterns. It's not random, but it's also not purposeful. It's like, imagine a complex machine with interlocking gears. The gears turn because of their physical structure, not because they're trying to achieve something. Storms happen because of atmospheric conditions. Earthquakes happen because of geological forces. Floods happen because of weather patterns and geography. There's no ghost in the machine. There's no divine hand adjusting the controls. And this leads to his second claim, which is even more provocative. Heaven has no intention. Now this is where Wang Chong directly attacks orthodox Confucian doctrine. The establishment view is that Tian, heaven, is quasi-personal. It has preferences. It cares about human morality. When rulers are virtuous, heaven sends good harvests. When rulers are corrupt, heaven sends disasters as warnings. Wang Chong says this is anthropomorphic nonsense. We're projecting human qualities onto natural processes. Heaven doesn't care about your moral failings any more than gravity cares whether you're a good person when you fall off a cliff. Think about it this way. If heaven really punished wickedness with natural disasters, why do disasters hit good people and bad people indiscriminately? Why do droughts affect the virtuous farmer just as much as the corrupt official? Why do earthquakes destroy temples along with brothels? The answer, Wang Chong says, is obvious. Because natural events have natural causes. They're not moral judgments. They're just physics. But here's where it gets really interesting and really uncomfortable for his contemporaries. This leads to Wang Chong's third claim. Human beings are cosmically insignificant. Listen to this quote from the Lun Heng. This is Wang Chong's own words. Man holds a place in the universe like that of a flea under a robe. A flea under a robe. Now, I want you to think about what this means. In the Confucian worldview, humans are special. We're the link between heaven and earth. We're the ones who can understand the moral order and live in harmony with it. We're central to the cosmic drama. Wang Chong says, no, we're not special. We're not central. We're tiny, temporary, insignificant creatures in a vast, indifferent universe that existed long before us and will continue long after we're gone. This is a profound philosophical move, and I want you to appreciate how difficult it is, because it's not just intellectually challenging, it's emotionally devastating. It strips away the comforting belief that the universe cares about us, that our suffering means something, that there's a cosmic justice keeping score. Wang Chong is saying, the universe doesn't care. It's not cruel. Cruelty requires intention. It's just indifferent. Now you might be thinking, okay, but isn't this just depressing? If we're insignificant and the universe doesn't care, what's the point of anything? But here's what's fascinating about Wang Chong. He doesn't see this as depressing. He sees it as liberating. Because if natural disasters aren't divine punishment, then you don't have to live in fear of angering heaven. If bad things happen for natural reasons, then you can study those reasons and maybe prevent them. If the universe isn't watching and judging, then you're free to focus on what actually matters. Human relationships, ethical behavior, practical improvements to society. You're free from superstition, free from fear, free to use your reason to understand the world as it actually is. And that's what makes Wang Chong not just a materialist, but a humanist. He's taking away the cosmic drama, but he's giving us back our agency, our ability to think clearly and act rationally. Okay, so we've established Wang Chong's big picture worldview, mechanistic universe, no divine intention, humans aren't special. Now let's watch him put this philosophy into action. Because this is where it gets fun. Wang Chong doesn't just make grand metaphysical claims, he gets down in the weeds. He systematically dismantles every popular superstition of his age. And he does it with this beautiful combination of logical rigor and biting sarcasm. Let's start with ghosts. Because in Han China, belief in ghosts isn't some fringe superstition. It's mainstream. Educated people believe in ghosts. Government officials believe in ghosts. There are elaborate rituals for dealing with ghosts. People make major life decisions based on ghost-related fears. And Wang Chong is like, really? We're doing this? Okay, let's think this through. Here's his argument, and I love how methodical it is. First question. If humans have ghosts after death, why don't animals? Think about it. You die. Supposedly your spirit persists. But your dog dies. No ghost? Your horse dies. Nothing. What makes humans special in this regard? Is it because we're more intelligent, more morally sophisticated? But wait, if intelligence determines whether you get a ghost, then shouldn't really smart people have stronger ghosts? Shouldn't philosophers haunt people more effectively than peasants? See what he's doing? He's taking the belief and pushing it to its logical conclusions, showing how it falls apart. Second question. If ghosts exist, why are they always wearing clothes? No, seriously. This is brilliant. People report seeing ghosts dressed in robes, right? Fully clothed apparitions, but clothes aren't alive. clothes don't have spirits, so either A. Clothing has ghosts too, which is absurd, or B. Ghosts are naked, and people are just imagining the clothes, which means they're imagining the whole thing. I mean, this is just devastating logic. He's not even being subtle about it. He's basically saying, you haven't thought this through at all, have you? Third question. If ghosts are spirits of the dead, why do they need to eat the food we offer them? This is another great one. There are elaborate rituals involving food offerings to ancestors and spirits, but Wang Chong asks, if you're a disembodied spirit, what are you doing with physical food? Do ghosts have digestive systems? Do they get hungry? And if they don't actually eat the food, if it's just symbolic, then why are we doing it? What's the mechanism by which this is supposed to work? Now here's what I want you to notice about Wang Chong's method. He's not just saying ghosts don't exist and leaving it at that. He's demanding evidence. He's demanding logical consistency. He's demanding that beliefs be subjected to rational scrutiny. This is proto-scientific thinking. This is the empirical method before it had a name. The slide mentions that when people claim to see ghosts, Wang Chong attributed it to psychological factors and illusions. And this is really sophisticated for his time. He's basically proposing that human perception is fallible, that we see what we expect to see, that fear and imagination can create experiences that feel real but aren't. Think about how advanced this is. He's not saying people are lying, he's saying they're mistaken. He's recognizing that subjective experience isn't the same as objective reality, that we need external verification, repeatable observations, logical analysis. This is the scientific method in the 1st century CE in China. But Wang Chong doesn't stop with ghosts. He goes after omens and portents with the same systematic approach. You know what an omen is, right? It's when you interpret a natural event as a sign or message. A comet appears, that means war is coming. A two-headed calf is born, that means the dynasty is in trouble. An eclipse happens, that means the emperor has lost heaven's mandate. And Wang Chong is just... He's had it with this nonsense. He demands, show me the causal mechanism. Explain to me how a comet in the sky causes a war on Earth. What's the connection? How does this work? And when people can't answer, when they just appeal to tradition or authority, he dismisses it. Not rudely, but firmly. He says, this is not knowledge. This is superstition masquerading as wisdom. Now, I want to read you something from the slide that I think is crucial. It says Wang Chong's method anticipated the scientific method centuries before its development in Europe. This is not an exaggeration. Let me show you the parallels. Scientific method. 1. Observe phenomena. 2. Form hypothesis. 3. Test through experiment or logic. 4. Demand reproducible results. 5. Reject claims without evidence. Wang Chong's method. 1. Observe what people believe. 2. Analyze the logical implications. 3. Test against reason and experience. 4. Demand concrete evidence. 5. Reject claims that fail scrutiny. It's the same process, the same intellectual rigor, the same refusal to accept things just because everyone believes them. And here's what makes this so remarkable. Wang Chong is doing this alone. He's not part of a scientific community. He doesn't have peer review or laboratories or centuries of accumulated knowledge. He just has his reason, his reading, and his courage. And he's taking on the entire intellectual establishment of his civilization. Think about what that takes. Think about the intellectual confidence required to say, all of you, all the scholars, all the officials, all the priests, all the traditions going back centuries, you're wrong. And I can prove it. That's not just philosophy, that's heroism. But here's the thing about demanding evidence and rational explanation. Once you start, you can't stop. Because if you're going to question ghosts and omens, you have to question everything, including the most sacred beliefs of your society. And that's exactly what Wang Chong does. Which brings us to his revolutionary epistemology, his theory of knowledge itself. But we'll get to that next. For now, just sit with this image, a self-taught philosopher in 1st century China, standing alone against superstition, armed with nothing but logic and the courage to follow it wherever it leads. Alright, now we're getting to what I think is Wang Chong's most important contribution, not just to Chinese philosophy but to human thought in general. Because what he's about to do is attack the very foundation of how knowledge works in his society. And that foundation is authority. Think about how knowledge typically gets transmitted in traditional societies, and honestly, in a lot of modern contexts too. Someone important says something. Maybe it's Confucius. Maybe it's an ancient text. Maybe it's your teacher, your parent, the emperor, the priest, and you're supposed to accept it. Why? Because they said it. Because they're the authority. Wang Chong says, that's not good enough. Listen to his central epistemological principle, and I want you to hear how radical this is. Theories must be supported by concrete evidence and experimental proof. Not tradition, not authority, not because the ancients said so. Evidence, proof. Things you can observe, test, verify. Now let me show you what this means in practice, because Wang Chong doesn't just state this principle, he lives it. And he applies it to the most sacred figure in Chinese intellectual life, Confucius himself. Confucius, by Wang Chong's time, isn't just respected, he's practically deified. There are temples to him. Scholars treat his words as infallible. The entire state ideology is built on his teachings, or at least what people claim are his teachings. And Wang Chong says, yeah, but was he right? Can you imagine the audacity? It's like standing up in medieval Europe and saying, maybe we should fact-check the Bible, or challenging Einstein at a physics conference. Except worse, because Confucius isn't just an intellectual authority, he's a cultural icon, a moral exemplar, almost a god, and Wang Chong treats him like a fallible human scholar who sometimes got things wrong. Here's what Wang Chong does. He goes through Confucian texts and points out contradictions, logical errors, claims that don't match observable reality. And he doesn't do it disrespectfully. He's not trying to destroy Confucius's reputation. He's trying to separate truth from legend, fact from mythology. He's saying, Confucius was a brilliant thinker. He made important contributions. But he was human. He had limitations. He made mistakes. And if we treat his words as infallible, we stop thinking for ourselves. This is revolutionary epistemology. This is the birth of critical thinking in a culture that had elevated tradition to the status of sacred truth. But Wang Chong goes further. He doesn't just criticize reliance on authority, he proposes an alternative. And this is where it gets really interesting, because he's essentially describing what we would call the scientific method. Look at his criteria for accepting a claim as true. First, observable evidence. Can you see it? Can you measure it? Can you demonstrate it to others? Second, logical consistency. Does it contradict itself? Does it lead to absurd conclusions? Does it make sense? Third, reproducibility. If it's true, it should be true every time, not just once. You should be able to test it repeatedly. Fourth, natural explanation. Before you invoke supernatural causes, exhaust all natural possibilities. The simplest explanation that fits the facts is usually correct. Do you see what he's doing? He's creating a methodology for distinguishing truth from falsehood that doesn't depend on who's making the claim. It doesn't matter if you're the emperor or a peasant, a scholar or a merchant. Your claim has to meet these standards. This is intellectual democracy. This is the idea that truth is accessible to anyone willing to use reason and observation. And you can imagine how well this went over with the establishment. Here's this minor official from the provinces telling the court scholars, your credentials don't impress me. Your fancy titles don't impress me. Show me your evidence or I'm not buying it. Yeah, that's a great way to get promoted. Really excellent career strategy, Wang Chong. But here's what I find so moving about this. Wang Chong knows he's sacrificing his career. He knows he's making enemies. He knows his work probably won't be appreciated in his lifetime, and he does it anyway. Because for him, truth matters more than success. Intellectual honesty matters more than fitting in. The pursuit of knowledge matters more than the approval of authorities. And this brings us to what the slide calls his rationalist method. Let me unpack what that means, because it's easy to misunderstand. When we say Wang Chong is a rationalist, we don't mean he thinks you can figure out everything just by sitting in a chair and thinking really hard. That's not what he's doing. He's not a pure rationalist in the way Descartes will be centuries later. Wang Chong's rationalism is empirically grounded. He believes reason is the tool we use to analyze evidence. Logic is how we test claims, but the claims themselves have to come from observation, from experience, from the world. So he's actually synthesizing two approaches that we often think of as opposed, rationalism and empiricism. He's saying, use your senses to gather data, then use your reason to make sense of it. Don't trust your senses blindly. They can deceive you. But don't trust pure reason blindly either. It needs to be anchored in reality. This is sophisticated epistemology. This is the kind of nuanced thinking about knowledge that we usually associate with much later periods. And you know what's tragic? This approach, this evidence-based, reason-driven methodology, it could have transformed Chinese intellectual life. Imagine if Wang Chong's ideas had been taken seriously. Imagine if the Han court had said, you know what? He's right. Let's stop consulting omens and start studying natural causes. Let's stop treating ancient texts as infallible and start testing their claims. Chinese science and philosophy could have taken a completely different trajectory, but it didn't happen. Wang Chong was ignored, marginalized, forgotten for centuries. But here's the thing, the truth doesn't care about timing. Good ideas don't expire. And Wang Chong's epistemology, his insistence on evidence, his rejection of blind authority, his commitment to rational inquiry, these principles are timeless. They're as relevant today as they were in the first century, maybe more so. So let's talk about what happened to Wang Chong, because this is where the story gets both sad and ultimately hopeful. During his lifetime? Nothing. His work was ignored. I mean, think about that. Here's one of the most original thinkers in Chinese history. A man who's essentially inventing the scientific method, who's challenging superstition with reason, who's creating a sophisticated materialist philosophy, and his contemporaries just don't care. Why? Well, the slide gives us some clues. His ideas were too advanced. His anti-authoritarian stance was too provocative. His materialism was threatening to established beliefs. But let me translate that into what it actually means. He was telling people things they didn't want to hear. Because here's the thing about challenging superstition and authority. It's not just an intellectual exercise, it's a threat to power structures. If you can't use omens to justify your policies, if you can't claim heaven's mandate, if you can't silence critics by appealing to ancient authority, then you actually have to govern well. You actually have to make rational arguments. You actually have to be accountable. And the people in power didn't want that. They wanted the comfort of tradition, the authority of the classics, the ability to explain away their failures as heaven's will. So Wang Chong was dangerous, not because he was violent or revolutionary in a political sense, but because he was asking questions that undermined the entire ideological foundation of Han society. And there's something else going on here too, something more psychological. Wang Chong's philosophy is uncomfortable. It strips away comforting illusions. It tells you the universe doesn't care about you, that your ancestors aren't watching over you, that there's no cosmic justice keeping score. That's a hard message to accept. Even if it's true, maybe especially if it's true, people don't want to hear it. But here's where the story gets interesting. Because even though Wang Chong was ignored in his lifetime, his ideas didn't die. They went underground. They influenced people in ways that weren't always obvious or acknowledged. The slide mentions the Neo-Taoist movement, the Xuanshui school of the 3rd and 4th centuries. These thinkers, people like Wang Bi, they're doing something different from classical Taoism. They're more rational, more naturalistic, more interested in metaphysics than mysticism. And where do you think they got that approach? Wang Chong. They didn't always cite him directly. They didn't build temples to him or declare themselves his followers. But his influence is there in their methods, in their assumptions, in their willingness to question orthodox Confucianism. Wang Chong planted seeds that took centuries to sprout. And then, and this is the really fascinating part, he gets rediscovered in the 19th and 20th centuries, and suddenly he's relevant again. Suddenly, Chinese intellectuals are looking for indigenous traditions of scientific thinking, of materialism, of rational inquiry. And there's Wang Chong, waiting for them in the historical record. It's like he's been in cryogenic storage for 1800 years, and now he's thawed out and his ideas are fresh again. Modern Chinese scholars, especially during the May 4th movement and the early communist period, they embrace Wang Chong as a symbol. Here's proof that scientific materialism isn't just a Western import. Here's a Chinese thinker who figured this out on his own centuries before Europe. Now, I want to be careful here because there's a danger in this kind of historical appropriation. Modern thinkers sometimes project their own ideas onto Wang Chong, make him more scientific than he actually was, ignore the ways his thought is still embedded in his own time and culture. Wang Chong wasn't a 20th century materialist. He was a first century Chinese philosopher working within and against his own intellectual traditions. But, and this is important, the core of his contribution is genuine. He really did advocate for evidence over authority. He really did challenge superstition with reason. He really did propose a naturalistic worldview. Those aren't modern projections. Those are actually there in his work. So what's Wang Chong's legacy? What does he leave us? First, he demonstrates that rationalism and empiricism aren't uniquely Western. The scientific revolution didn't have to happen in Europe. The seeds of scientific thinking existed in other cultures. They just didn't always find fertile ground. Second, he shows us what intellectual courage looks like. The willingness to stand alone. The willingness to sacrifice career advancement for truth. The willingness to be unpopular, misunderstood, ignored, and to keep thinking and writing anyway. Third, he reminds us that good ideas can be ahead of their time. That being right doesn't guarantee being heard. That influence can be delayed but still real. And fourth, and I think this is the most important, he proves that one person, working alone, with limited resources, can make a difference, can challenge an entire civilization's assumptions, can plant seeds that will eventually grow. Wang Chong couldn't afford books, so he memorized them at bookstalls. He couldn't get a good government position, so he wrote in obscurity. He couldn't convince his contemporaries, so he wrote for posterity, and posterity eventually listened. There's something almost heroic about that. This stubborn, combative, brilliant man, refusing to compromise, refusing to give up, refusing to accept comfortable lies. The slide ends with a note about his modern rediscovery, and I want you to think about what that means. It means that truth has a way of surfacing, that good ideas, even when suppressed or ignored, have a kind of resilience. Wang Chong was forgotten for over a millennium, but he wasn't erased. His work survived. And when the time was right, when Chinese intellectuals were ready to hear his message, there he was, waiting. That's the power of writing. That's the power of ideas. You can silence a person, but you can't silence their arguments, not permanently, not if those arguments are sound. Wang Chong lost every battle in his lifetime, but he won the war. Because we're still reading him. We're still talking about him. We're still inspired by his courage and his clarity. And that's a kind of immortality that no amount of official recognition in his own time could have guaranteed. So now that we understand Wang Chong's philosophy and his legacy, I want to show you something really striking. I want to put him side by side with his contemporaries and let you see just how different his thinking was, because the contrast it's almost shocking. Okay, I want to do something different here. I want to show you visually, dramatically, just how radical Wang Chong was. Because sometimes we read about historical figures and we think, oh, he was ahead of his time, but we don't really feel it. We don't viscerally understand the gap between them and their contemporaries. So I'm going to put Wang Chong on trial. I'm going to bring in his contemporaries as witnesses. And you're going to see the chasm between them. Imagine we're in a Han Dynasty courtroom. The year is 85 CE. Wang Chong is being questioned about his beliefs. And one by one, we're going to compare what everyone else thinks with what he thinks. Ready? Let's go. Round 1. Confucius. His contemporaries say, Confucius was a divine sage, perhaps even a god. He possessed supernatural wisdom. His words are infallible. To question Confucius is to question heaven itself. Wang Chong says, Confucius was a brilliant human scholar, emphasis on human. He made important contributions to ethics and governance. But he was fallible. He made mistakes. He had limitations. And if we treat him as infallible, we stop thinking for ourselves. We turn philosophy into dogma. Do you see the difference? It's not that Wang Chong disrespects Confucius. He actually admires him, but he refuses to worship him. He refuses to turn a philosopher into a deity. And in Han China, that's borderline blasphemy. Round 2. Supernatural forces. His contemporaries say, we must fear supernatural forces. Ghosts walk among us. Spirits of the dead can harm the living. We must perform rituals, make offerings, consult mediums. The boundary between the living and the dead is thin and permeable. Wang Chong says, ghosts don't exist. Show me evidence. Show me a mechanism. Why would only humans have ghosts? Why would ghosts wear clothes? Why would they need food offerings? This is superstition based on fear and imagination, not observation and reason. And here's what's so important. Wang Chong isn't just saying, "I don't believe in ghosts." He's demanding that believers explain the logic of their beliefs. He's asking questions they can't answer. That's not just skepticism, that's intellectual aggression. Round 3. Heaven's judgment. His contemporaries say, heaven punishes wickedness with disasters. When earthquakes strike, when floods come, when droughts devastate the land, these are heaven's judgments on human immorality. When rulers are corrupt, heaven sends signs. Natural disasters are moral messages. Wang Chong says disasters occur randomly without moral purpose. They're caused by natural forces, atmospheric conditions, geological processes, weather patterns. They hit good people and bad people indiscriminately. If heaven really punished wickedness, why do virtuous farmers suffer in droughts? Why do corrupt officials sometimes prosper? The universe doesn't care about human morality. This is huge. This is Wang Chong stripping away the entire moral framework that holds Han society together. Because if disasters aren't divine punishment, then you can't use them to justify political changes. You can't claim heaven's mandate. You can't explain away your failures as cosmic judgment. You actually have to take responsibility. Round 4. Ghostly visitations. His contemporaries say, people see ghosts, respectable people, educated people. They report visitations from the dead. They receive messages from ancestors. These experiences are real. We have testimony from credible witnesses. Wang Chong says, people think they see ghosts, but human perception is fallible. Fear creates illusions. Expectations shape what we see. Grief can cause hallucinations. There's no afterlife. When you die, your consciousness ends. These ghost sightings are psychological phenomena, not supernatural events. Do you hear what he's doing? He's proposing a psychological explanation for religious experiences. He's saying, your experience feels real to you, but that doesn't make it objectively real. This is cognitive science in the 1st century CE. Round 5. Divination and omens. His contemporaries say, we must consult omens before making important decisions. The flight of birds, the patterns of cracks in oracle bones, the appearance of comets, these reveal heaven's will. Divination and geomancy guide us. The cosmos speaks to those who know how to listen. Wang Chong says, show me the causal mechanism. Explain how a comet in the sky causes events on Earth. Explain how the pattern of cracks in a bone predicts the future. You can't, because there is no mechanism. This is pattern-seeking behavior gone wrong. Humans see connections that don't exist. We need evidence and rational explanation, not mystical interpretation. And this is where Wang Chong is most dangerous to the establishment. Because divination isn't just superstition, it's a tool of political control. If you can claim to interpret heaven's will, you have power. You can justify your decisions as cosmically ordained. Wang Chong is taking that power away. Now let me step back and show you what we've just witnessed. Look at the pattern. His contemporaries. Appeal to authority, tradition, supernatural explanation, subjective experience, moral purpose in nature. Wang Chong demands evidence, logical consistency, natural explanation, objective verification, mechanistic universe. These aren't just different opinions. These are different epistemologies, different ways of knowing, different standards for what counts as truth. Wang Chong is living in a completely different intellectual universe than his contemporaries. He's speaking a different language, operating by different rules. And here's what makes this so remarkable. He's not doing this because he's been exposed to some alternative tradition. He's not borrowing from Greek philosophy or Indian logic. He's figured this out on his own, through reading, observation, and sheer force of intellect. He's invented scientific thinking independently, and his contemporaries think he's crazy, or dangerous, or both. Because from their perspective, Wang Chong isn't just wrong. He's undermining the foundations of civilization. He's attacking the beliefs that hold society together. He's destroying the moral order. But from Wang Chong's perspective, he's the only sane person in an asylum. He's the only one willing to face reality. He's the only one brave enough to say, the emperor has no clothes, heaven isn't watching, the universe doesn't care, and we need to deal with that. So we've traveled through Wang Chong's life and philosophy. We've seen his courage, his brilliance, his isolation. And now I want to ask, Why does this matter? Why should we care about a Chinese philosopher from the 1st century who was ignored in his own time? Let me give you 3 reasons, and I think by the end you'll see why Wang Chong isn't just a historical curiosity. He's a model for how to live. First, fearless critique. The slide says Wang Chong's fearless critique of superstition and advocacy for evidence-based thought remain profoundly inspiring today, and I want to unpack what fearless really means here, because it's easy to be brave when you have support, when you're part of a movement, when there are others standing with you. Wang Chong had none of that. He was alone. Think about what it takes to stand up and say, everyone is wrong. All the scholars, all the officials, all the traditions going back centuries, wrong. That's not just intellectual confidence. That's a kind of moral courage that most of us will never be tested on. And here's what makes it even more remarkable. Wang Chong knew the cost. He wasn't naive. He knew that challenging authority would limit his career. He knew that attacking superstition would make him unpopular. He knew that his work might be ignored. He did it anyway. Because for Wang Chong, truth wasn't negotiable. It wasn't something you compromised on for career advancement or social acceptance. It was the thing that mattered most. And that fearlessness, that refusal to be silenced by consequences, that's what we need today. Because let me tell you something. Every age has its superstitions. They don't always look like belief in ghosts or omens. Sometimes they're dressed up in sophisticated language. Sometimes they're embedded in institutions. Sometimes they're so widely accepted that questioning them seems crazy. But they're still superstitions. They're still beliefs held without evidence, maintained by authority, protected by social pressure, and every age needs people willing to be Wang Chong, willing to ask uncomfortable questions, willing to demand evidence, willing to say, I don't care how many people believe this, show me why it's true. That's fearless critique. And it's as necessary now as it was in Han China. Second, born from adversity. The slide says, his life reminds us that rational inquiry often begins in adversity and opposition. And I want you to really sit with this, because it's profound. Wang Chong was poor. He couldn't afford books. He had to stand at bookstalls and memorize what he read. He was marginalized, excluded from the centers of power and prestige. And you might think, that's tragic. Imagine what he could have accomplished if he'd had resources, support, institutional backing. But here's the thing. Maybe his poverty and marginalization weren't obstacles to his thinking. Maybe they were essential to it. Because when you're inside the system, when you're comfortable, when you have a stake in the status quo, it's really hard to question it. Your career depends on not rocking the boat. Your social position depends on accepting the rules of the game. But when you're outside, when you have nothing to lose, when the system has already rejected you, then you're free. Wang Chong's poverty meant he didn't owe anyone anything. His lack of prestigious credentials meant he didn't have to defend the orthodox position. His marginal status meant he could afford to be radical. Adversity gave him intellectual freedom. And this is something I want you to remember if you ever feel like you're on the outside. If you ever feel like you don't have the right credentials or the right connections or the right background. Some of the most important thinking in human history has come from outsiders, from people who weren't supposed to be part of the conversation, from people who had to fight for every scrap of knowledge they gained. The establishment produces competent scholars who refine existing ideas, but it's the outsiders, the self-taught rebels, the marginalized thinkers, the people with nothing to lose, who revolutionize how we think. Wang Chong proves that. His adversity didn't limit him, it liberated him. Third, timeless challenge. The slide says, as a pioneer of naturalism and skepticism, Wang Chong's philosophy challenges us to question assumptions, seek evidence, and embrace the natural world with open minds. But I want to go deeper than that, because Wang Chong isn't just challenging us to think differently about specific issues. He's challenging us to think differently about how we think. Here's his fundamental question, the question that runs through everything he wrote. How do you know that? Not, what do you believe? Not, what does tradition say? Not, what do the authorities claim? How do you know? And when you start asking that question seriously, when you really demand evidence and logical consistency, everything changes. You can't just accept things because they're comfortable. You can't just believe things because everyone else does. You can't just defer to authority and tradition. You have to think. You have to investigate. You have to be willing to be wrong. And this is hard. This is really hard because it means living with uncertainty. It means admitting ignorance. It means constantly questioning yourself. It's much easier to just accept what you're told, to trust the experts, to go along with the crowd. But Wang Chong says, that's not good enough. If you want truth, you have to work for it. You have to think for yourself. And here's what I find so moving about this. Wang Chong is offering us a kind of intellectual dignity. He's saying, you don't have to be a passive recipient of other people's ideas. You don't have to accept things on authority. You have the capacity to reason, to observe, to judge for yourself. You are capable of thinking, and that's a radical claim, because most systems, most institutions, most authorities, most traditions, they don't really want you to think. They want you to obey, to accept, to conform. Wang Chong wants you to think, and when you do, when you really embrace that challenge, when you question assumptions and seek evidence and use your reason, you become dangerous. Not violent, not destructive, but dangerous to lies, dangerous to superstition, dangerous to unjust authority. You become someone who can't be easily controlled or manipulated. Someone who demands truth. You become, in a small way, like Wang Chong. Truth emerges not from tradition or authority, but from observation, reason, and the courage to challenge the accepted wisdom of one's age. That's Wang Chong's legacy. That's his gift to us across 2 millennia. Not a set of doctrines to memorize, not a new authority to replace the old ones, but a method, an attitude, a commitment to truth over comfort.